Ensign William Billy Crowell lined up his approach and prayed his airplane wouldn't kill him. The F4U Corsair was the fastest, most powerful fighter in the U.S. Navy's arsenal. It should have been a dream to fly. It was a nightmare. The nose stretched 14 feet in front of the cockpit, so long that Crowell couldn't see the carrier deck during approach. He was landing blind, trusting instruments and instinct while a massive radial engine blocked his entire forward view. 300 feet, 200. The landing signal officer waved him in. Crowell couldn't see him. He could barely see the ship. 100 feet, 50. The Corsair's wheels touched the deck. For a split second, everything seemed fine. Then the left wing dropped. Without warning, the aircraft snapped left, the wingtip slamming into the deck, and the Corsair cartwheeled across the flight deck, shedding pieces as it tumbled toward the ocean. Crowell was thrown from the wreckage. His body slid across the deck and disappeared over the side. He was 22 years old. He was the third pilot to die in a Corsair landing that week. The aircraft had a nickname among the young pilots who flew it: the Ensign Killer. Not a joke, a warning. The Navy looked at the death toll and made a decision. The F4U Corsair was officially banned from carrier operations. It was declared a failed project. Too dangerous, too deadly, too broken to ever be fixed. They were wrong. 3 years later, the Ensign Killer would achieve an 11-to-1 kill ratio against the Japanese, the highest of any American fighter in the Pacific War. But getting there required something the Navy engineers couldn't provide. It required the men who refused to give up on a broken machine. Let me explain why the Corsair should have been the greatest fighter ever built. In 1938, the Navy issued a specification for a new carrier-based fighter. They wanted speed. They wanted power. They wanted the fastest, deadliest aircraft in the sky. Vought Aircraft answered with a radical design. The F4U Corsair was built around the most powerful engine ever fitted to a fighter, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, an absolute monster of an engine. But that engine created a problem. To harness 2,000 horsepower, you needed a massive propeller, 13 feet 4 inches in diameter. That propeller needed ground clearance, especially on a carrier where space was limited. The obvious solution was long landing gear, but long landing gear was heavy, complicated, and prone to failure. Vaught's engineers found a different answer. They designed inverted gull wings, wings that bent downward at the root before angling back up. This shape allowed the landing gear to be shorter while still providing propeller clearance. The result was an aircraft unlike anything else in the sky. The bent wings gave the Corsair a distinctive silhouette that would become legendary. But legendary didn't mean safe. The inverted gull wings created airflow problems that nobody fully understood. At low speeds, exactly the speeds used for carrier landings, the left wing would sometimes stall before the right. When that happened, the aircraft snapped left without warning. At 100 feet above a carrier deck, there was no time to recover. Pilots died. The long nose created another problem. During landing approach, the pilot had to fly in a curved pattern to keep the deck in sight. At the last moment, he would straighten out for touchdown, completely blind. If his lineup was wrong, he had no way to know until he hit the deck. Pilots died. The landing gear had a tendency to bounce on touchdown. On a carrier deck, bouncing meant overshooting the arresting cables. Overshooting meant crashing into the barrier or going over the side. Pilots died. By late 1942, the Navy had seen enough. The F4U Corsair was officially removed from carrier duty. It was declared unfit for the role it had been designed for. The greatest fighter in the Navy's arsenal was a failure. And now here's where this story takes a turn that nobody expected. When the Navy decided the Corsair was too dangerous to fly from carriers, they had a problem. They'd already built hundreds of them. They couldn't just throw them away. So they did the next best thing. They gave them to the Marines. The Navy saw this as a way to salvage something from a failed project. The Marines saw something else entirely. They saw a chance to take a weapon everyone else had rejected and make it their own. The Marines received their first Corsairs in early 1943. The Navy's message was clear. These planes don't work on carriers. Use them from land bases. Try not to kill yourselves. The Marines looked at the Corsairs. They looked at the death reports. They looked at the engineering assessments that said the problems couldn't be fixed. And then they started fixing the problems. The first issue was the deadly wing drop. Marine mechanics working in primitive conditions on Pacific Islands did something the vault engineers hadn't tried. They attached a small wooden strip to the leading edge of the right wing, maybe 6 inches long, a 1/4 inch high. That was it. A strip of wood smaller than a ruler. But that strip changed everything. The wood created a tiny bit of turbulence that caused the right wing to stall at the same time as the left. No more asymmetric stall. No more sudden snap to the left. No more pilots dying from a problem that appeared without warning. A 6-inch piece of wood solved a problem that had killed dozens of aviators. The Navy engineers, with their wind tunnels and their slide rules, hadn't figured it out. A marine mechanic with a piece of scrap lumber did. The second issue was visibility. The long nose couldn't be shortened. The engine was the engine. But the approach could be changed. Marine pilots developed a new landing technique. Instead of a straight approach with a last-second correction, they flew a continuous curving approach, keeping the runway in sight until the final seconds of touchdown. It was harder to learn. It required more skill. But it worked. The Marines also discovered something else about the Corsair. It didn't need carriers. The bent wings that caused problems on carrier decks were perfect for the rough coral strips the Marines were fighting from. The wide stance of the inverted gull wings made the aircraft stable on uneven ground, and the powerful engine could drag the fighter out of the soft surfaces that bogged down other aircraft. The Corsair wasn't broken. It had been designed for the wrong mission. In the hands of the Marines flying from land bases, the F4U found its true purpose, and it was about to become the deadliest fighter in the Pacific. Here's something the Japanese were about to learn the hard way. The Corsair wasn't just fixed. It was unleashed. All that power, all that speed, all that firepower that the Navy couldn't use because of carrier landing problems. The Marines could use every bit of it, and they were about to use it to tear the Japanese Air Force apart. February 1943. Guadalcanal. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington climbed into the cockpit of his Corsair and grinned. Boyington was not a typical Marine officer. He was a drunk, a troublemaker, and officially a disgrace. He'd been kicked out of the Flying Tigers, failed to pay his debts, and annoyed every superior officer he'd ever served under. But he could fly, and the Marines, desperate for experienced pilots, were willing to overlook his many, many problems. They gave him a squadron of misfits and rejects, pilots who didn't fit anywhere else. Boyington called them the Black Sheep. The Black Sheep received Corsairs that the Navy had rejected, pilots who had been rejected flying planes that had been rejected. It was a match made in bureaucratic desperation. It became a legend. Boyington understood something about the Corsair that the Navy assessors had missed. Yes, it was difficult to land. Yes, it had visibility problems. Yes, it was dangerous. But in the air, away from carrier decks and landing patterns, the Corsair was a monster. It was faster than the Zero at every altitude. It could dive faster without shedding its wings. It could absorb damage that would have destroyed any Japanese fighter. And it was armed with 6.50 caliber machine guns, enough firepower to shred any aircraft in a single burst. Boyington developed tactics that exploited every Corsair advantage. Speed. Never turn fight a Zero. Use your speed to climb, dive, and extend away from danger. Firepower. Don't nibble at the target. Close in, pour everything you have into one devastating burst, and move on to the next. Durability. The Zero had no armor. The Corsair did. In a head-on pass, the Corsair would win every time. The Black Sheep started racking up kills. Boyington himself shot down 22 confirmed Japanese aircraft in Corsairs, adding to his Flying Tiger total to become the top Marine ace of the war. But the Black Sheep were just the beginning. The Japanese had names for every American aircraft. The P-38 Lightning was Two-Tailed Devil. The P-40 Warhawk was Tiger Shark. The B-29 Superfortress was simply B-San, Mr. B. For the Corsair, they had a special name, Whistling Death. The Corsair made a distinctive sound as it dove. The air flowing over the wing roots created a high-pitched whistle that could be heard on the ground before you could see the aircraft. To Japanese soldiers and pilots, that whistle was the sound of death coming. The Corsair was faster than the Zero in level flight. It was faster in a dive, and it could absorb punishment that would destroy Japanese fighters outright, and it had firepower that could tear apart targets in a single pass. The kill ratio told the story. The F-4F Wildcat, the Navy's previous carrier fighter, achieved a kill ratio of about 5.9 to 1 against Japanese aircraft. Respectable. Good. The F-6F Hellcat, the Navy's replacement for the Corsair on carriers, achieved about 19 to 1. Excellent. Devastating. The F4U Corsair, the Ensign Killer that the Navy had rejected, achieved 11 to 1. Wait, 11 to 1? That's lower than the Hellcat. But here's what that number doesn't tell you. The Corsair flew in the worst conditions. The Marines took the island-hopping campaign, the close air support missions, the ground attack runs that put aircraft in range of anti-aircraft fire, and the Corsair absorbed punishment that would have downed any other fighter. The Hellcat flew from carriers in controlled conditions with support systems the Marines never had. 11 to 1 in hell is more impressive than 19 to 1 in comfort. The Marines flew 64,051 Corsair sorties in World War II. They lost 189 aircraft to enemy fire, 189. They destroyed 2,140 Japanese aircraft. The failed project, the Ensign Killer, the plane the Navy threw away. It became the most successful Marine fighter of the war. What makes a weapon truly great? Is it the engineering specifications, the factory testing, the official assessments, or is it what happens when real people take a flawed machine and make it work anyway? The Corsair wasn't great because of what Vought designed, and it was great because of what the Marines refused to accept. Here's the final irony of the Corsair story. By 1944, the Navy changed its mind. The British Royal Navy had figured out how to land Corsairs on carriers. They modified their approach technique, coming in with a curved descent that kept the deck visible. The same technique the Marines had developed independently. They proved it could be done safely. Suddenly, the Navy was interested again. In late 1944, the F4U Corsair returned to U.S. Navy carrier service. The same aircraft that had been banned. The same aircraft that had killed so many young ensigns. The same failed project that was supposed to be too dangerous to ever work. Now it was the premier carrier fighter of the Pacific Fleet. The mechanic's stall strip fix was incorporated into factory production, and the landing approach techniques were standardized. The problems that had seemed unsolvable in 1942 were now routine procedures. By 1945, the Corsair was flying from carriers alongside the Hellcat, proving that the Navy's original vision wasn't wrong, just premature. The aircraft stayed in service after the war. It flew in Korea, achieving the last propeller-driven air-to-air kill in American history. It served into the 1960s with reserve units. The Ensign Killer had a career spanning over 20 years. Not bad for a failed project. The Corsair's story isn't just about an airplane. It's about what happens when institutional thinking meets practical problem-solving. The Navy looked at the Corsair's problems and saw failure. They had processes, specifications, requirements. The aircraft didn't meet them. Therefore, the aircraft was defective. The Marines looked at the same problems and saw opportunities. They didn't care about specifications. They cared about killing the enemy. And if that meant fixing problems with scrap wood and modified techniques, they'd do it. The 6-inch stall strip is the perfect example. Vought's engineers had slide rules and wind tunnels. They had decades of aeronautical experience. They couldn't solve the wing drop problem. A Marine mechanic with a piece of lumber solved it in an afternoon. Not because the mechanic was smarter. Because the mechanic was there, in the field, watching pilots die, desperate to find any solution that worked. Necessity doesn't just breed invention. It breeds the willingness to try things that shouldn't work. Today, the F4U Corsair is recognized as one of the greatest fighters of World War II. Museums display it with pride. Veterans speak of it with reverence. Aviation historians study its innovative design. Nobody remembers that the Navy called it a failure. Nobody remembers that it was banned from carriers. Nobody remembers that they tried to throw it away. They only remember what it became. Whistling death. 11-1. The best Marine fighter of the war. The F4U Corsair started as a dream of power and speed. It became a nightmare of crashed landings and dead pilots. Then it became something else entirely. A weapon that couldn't be beaten. A fighter that terrified the enemy so badly they gave it a name. A legend built not in factories but on airstrips of coral and mud. The Navy saw a failure. The Marines saw potential. And the Japanese saw whistling death. And 11 pilots came home for everyone that didn't. The planes that work perfectly out of the factory get the glory. The planes that get fixed with scrap wood and determination become legends. The Ensign Killer became the greatest Marine fighter of the war. Not because it was perfect, because the men who flew it refused to let it fail. If this story of a rejected fighter becoming the deadliest weapon in the Pacific gripped you, smash that subscribe button right now. This channel uncover the forgotten stories of World War II, the weapons that shouldn't have worked, the pilots who refused to give up, and the moments that changed everything. Tap that bell icon so you never miss when I drop a new video. And I need to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Do you think the Navy was right to reject the Corsair? Or did they give up too soon? Let's debate. Share this with someone who loves aviation history. And if you want another incredible World War II story right now, the next video is already waiting on screen. I'll see you there.